Alright everyone, grab your copium. This video is for people who don't listen to my other videos. We've really kind of started scratching the bottom of the barrel for Genshin content, so instead of making the same guide 14 times, I'm actually just going to tell you guys how to improve a character that is actually bad for a specific role just because you want to play them. As is usual with Genshin, it depends, and there's always going to be exceptions on things like these videos. Just understand that I can't cover every possible exception because that would take up way too much damn time, and honestly I just don't really want to do it, so enjoy the video. The other day, I was playing on some friends' accounts, trying to clear Abyss for them. Why? Well, one of them runs Kokomi for Hutao Vape and I had to fix that, but also I just enjoy challenging myself. Because once you get to a certain point with your account on Genshin Impact, the content gets significantly easier to clear, and it can even be less fun if you're not making your own challenging content. So it can be fun to use completely different resources to clear Abyss. For some players though, this is just the reality of their normal gameplay. Genshin Impact is a game that can be played like a power fantasy where you just try to outscale all of the content with super powerful meta characters and teams, but it can also be a game where you pick a character you like to play and have them be the center of your team all the time. Most players that follow this channel are more focused on meta, but you'll find that the overwhelming majority of the Genshin player base will pull a character they like the design and personality of and use them as their main DPS. If this is a situation that you find yourself in, then make sure to pay extra attention, because in this video, I'm going to be talking about multiple ways to improve your damage with any character. This video is focused on characters that don't have a meta use or aren't already a DPS unit, so if you came here wanting to learn how to make Ganyu or Eula a main DPS, they already are. And I have plenty of team options for them in my guide videos that I highly recommend you guys check out. I do quickly want to put a disclaimer here too. While your damage will improve from building your teams this way, I can't in any way guarantee that you'll have an easy time with things like Spiral Abyss. Abyss will always be easier with meta teams, and there are some characters that even with a perfect team will perform poorly in Abyss. Some characters can get an absurd amount of buffs and still not be very good. But the goal of this video is to teach you how to use your resources and team building skills to try and make any character that isn't normally a DPS deal more damage. With that out of the way, let's talk about how you can make any character your main damage dealer. So the first thing that I want to talk about in this video is buffs. Now, I'm going to be telling you guys what they are and why they're important. Buffs are essentially stat increases in one form or another. When somebody says Bennett buff, they're talking about Bennett's elemental burst that gives you a bunch of attack bonus. There's tons of buffs in the game, and it's really crazy how many players don't understand the importance of them. You could have a character with 0 artifacts on, and they could still do insane damage as long as you have the right buffs applied. You can get attack buffs from things like the Tenacity of the Millilith set, the Noblesse set, Bennett's burst, Sara's elemental skill or burst, Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayer's the 3-star weapon, and a ton more other things. Some characters even have attack gain passives that affect the whole team. And there's more than attack too. You can get elemental mastery buffs from Sucrose and the Instructor set. You can get defense buffs from Goro, crit rate from Hutao and Rosaria. There's just so many ways to improve your stats, and you should absolutely be taking advantage of them. Buffs are actually the fundamental idea behind hyper carry teams. Anytime you see X character hyper carry, it features that character with 2 of the strongest buff units in the game, alongside a more customized support or sub DPS. For example, Raiden Hyper Carry features Raiden, the best attack buffer Bennett, the best electro buffer Sara, and the best elemental damage buffer Kazuha. With those characters combined, Raiden is able to destroy basically everything in the game. The same thing can apply to characters who aren't meant to be main DPS too, like Yae Miko, who utilizes the same characters and can deal a bunch more damage proportionately to her normal setup, or replace Sara with Yunjin for more normal attack damage. The main takeaway you should be getting from hyper carry teams is that literally any elemental damage dealer can carry if you have Kazuha and Bennett, but they're not the only options you have. If you're using a physical damage dealer, you won't get much value out of Kazuha's buffs in comparison to other options, like running Lisa for Superconduct and holding Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers, which will buff your next character's attack by a whole bunch. One other thing I want to quickly cover is snapshotting, which is essentially when a character has a temporary buff and they're able to take a snapshot of those stats that'll last for the entire skill or burst of that character. For example, if you give Beto the buff from Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers and also a Bennett buff, when you go ahead and use her burst, even if those buffs fall off of her character, the burst will still deal the same amount of damage because the game thinks that the stats never actually fell off until the duration of Beto's burst is over. It can be a super helpful tip to improving your team's damage with certain setups, and I highly recommend looking up if your character can snapshot buffs. Usually this information is in different discords if you're looking for a specific character, but most of the time you can just Google it, or you can check any of my guides and I'll usually let you know. I'll go into more details about exactly what teams you can run later. This will be conducive to the buff part, but first I want to explain debuffs, which are another thing that you're going to want to pay attention to when you're building a team. So I just just mentioned Lisa as a good pick for physical teams, but she can also just be a good pick in general for teams that aren't reaction based. Lisa has an Ascension passive that lowers enemy defense by 15% for 10 seconds with her burst. Now this is a debuff, and debuffs aren't nearly as common in Genshin as buffs. However, a debuff can often be stronger than a buff for your character. The reason is that a buff will apply to your active character, which can increase their stats and overall damage, but a debuff on an enemy's defense or resistances can increase your damage dealt to that specific enemy more than a buff to your own character. And on top of that, a debuffed enemy will take more damage from your entire team rather than just one buffed character. There's a lot of complexity to how it works in terms of math, but in general, debuffs can be super important to team building. For example, in physical teams, you want to utilize the Superconduct debuff. Activating Superconduct reaction with Cryo and Electro will lower the enemy's physical resistance by 40% for 12 seconds, which is super helpful for increasing physical damage in general, but also gets a lot of value against enemies that typically resist physical damage like Ruin enemies. In elemental teams though, you'd want to use an artifact set to debuff enemies instead of Superconduct. The artifact set is called Viridescent Venerer, and it makes it so that when you swirl an element on an enemy, they lose 40% elemental resistance to whatever was swirled. By combining team buffs with enemy debuffs, your damage is going to increase substantially. All of this stuff eventually circles back to team building. Sometimes you don't really need thousands of buffs to make a character good, sometimes all you really need is the right supporting units. A super obvious example of this is Kokomi Taser. Most players at the higher level would agree that Kokomi's damage isn't super comparable to other strong carry units, but in a Taser setup specifically, Kokomi makes a strong main damage dealer that not only can drive reactions, but also heal the team, and her damage does contribute to Taser a lot. In that setup, you can even pass an attack buff to Beto with Thrilling Tales, and you also have the option of Tenacity the Middle Official to buff your entire team's attack stat. Kokomi Taser is an awesome example of a character that can be super broken in the right team. Another example is Raiden Hypercarry. In a Raiden Hypercarry team, you're going to have Raiden, Bennett, Sara, and Kazuha, and the reason that this team works is because you're turning Raiden into a ridiculously strong nuke every 20 seconds. With Bennett's attack buff, the 20% attack buff from 4-piece Noblesse, Sara's attack buff and C6 crit damage buff, and Kazuha's elemental damage buff combined with his electro resistance debuff, Raiden's damage will get boosted through the ceiling to just absolutely astronomical numbers. Without Kazuha, you can put Sucrose in the team instead for resistance shred and have her hold Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers, but do know that it will be difficult to pass the Thrilling Tales buff to Raiden in this setup because Sara's buff is short and the Thrilling Tales buff is also short, so it just becomes kind of hard. But overall though, the concept behind this team is giga buffing Raiden, and it works extremely well. But it doesn't just work for Raiden. The point of this video was to kind of show that you can increase other characters' damage numbers substantially just by building the right supports around them. And as an example of this, you could put Yai or Lisa in place of Raiden, and this team would still be strong for them as well. Now, would this team compare to other hypercarry teams? Not at all. And why? Because Lisa isn't really meant to be a main DPS. Like, she can put out some damage with her elemental skill, but she has better uses. And on top of that, you have the same deal with Yai. Her multipliers on her normal attacks just aren't super great, but her turret damage can be pretty solid. But with that in mind, it's not going to be as good as your normal hypercarry teams, but it's going to make it astronomically better just because you're using the right combination of buffs with those characters. For players who have been playing for a really long time, this seems super obvious, but you'd be surprised how many players just aren't using buffing characters because they just want to play 4 characters in a team, and then they don't realize, like, oh dang, my physical DPS Toma could be doing literally 3 times the damage right now. The other thing with this team is if you replace Sara with Yunjin and Raiden with Ayato, you'd have Ayato hypercarry, which is fundamentally the same concept, except for Yunjin is buffing Ayato's normal attacks rather than just giving an attack buff. And Yunjin actually is a very powerful tool for trying to create main DPS characters that weren't meant to be main DPS, because she's able to increase your normal attack damage, and that is just such a powerful utility. For normal attackers, Yunjin actually can increase your normal attack damage more than Bennett would with his attack buff. So in a lot of instances, Yunjin can be a better pick. On top of that, there's also teams that really take advantage of reactions alongside buffs too, like Mona Hypercarry, for example. This team is not super common, not super popular, but it is very strong when you play it right. With this team, you're able to use Mona charged attacks to get 2 times vaporized damage, and Xiangling is able to take full advantage of Bennett and Kazuha with her snapshot on her burst. Kazuha will be able to swirl both Hydro and Pyro to lower enemy resistances to both Mona and Xiangling, and with Mona's burst that improves team damage against certain enemies, the team is actually pretty functional and very strong in the right scenarios. Now, another team type that I see a lot of players go for is physical team setups. I'd always recommend using Cryo and Electro characters as physical carries, but some players opt for characters like Xinyan and Toma. Regardless, you're always going to need a Cryo and Electro character in your team for physical damage carries, but some characters can be more useful than others. For example, with the new Clam set, Chi-Chi can actually output solid extra physical damage just for doing her job, which is healing. But she also applies Cryo, which can be good for Superconduct as well. Lisa can also be a solid pick for Electro, since she'll be able to lower enemy defense and also pass on the Thrilling Healing Tail's attack buff, and you'll want to consider bringing Bennett along for healing and a massive attack buff as well. In any team where a character is dealing lots of normal attack damage, Yunjin is a must-have for a normal attack buff too, like we said earlier, and as you can see, there's just tons of ways to buff your main carry. And ultimately, if you're already building a character to be DPS that isn't meant to be a DPS, you're gonna need tons of buffs regardless, just to make their damage even worth going for. As long as you're funneling tons of attack and damage bonus into your carry, as well as debuffing enemy defense and resistances, you can deal solid damage with any character in the game. I don't have the clip of this, but I saw someone the other day hitting 70k Diona charge shots. Like, it's possible to deal damage with literally anyone. Again, I do just want to make sure that you guys know I'm not encouraging you to try to optimize something like Toma main DPS for Abyss. It's just not going to be as good. Some characters will just be bad as main DPS even with tons of buffs and team synergies, because Hoyo did really try to force certain characters to be nearly unusable as DPS in some cases. These teams aren't going to guarantee you'll be able to clear hard content, but if you're already going to force a character that's not a dedicated damage dealer to be your main DPS, you might as well try to improve that character's damage output. Whether you're a Toma main, Barbara main, or main whoever this is, you can improve your damage by a ton. It'll take a lot of investment, but any character is playable, even if it's incredibly inconvenient. Anyways, you guys, make sure to leave a like down below if you've enjoyed the video, and make sure to subscribe if you want to see more content from me, and make sure to let me know down in the comments who you're running as your main DPS if it's non-conventional. Also, make sure to check out the Twitch if you want to see live Genshin content. We do lots of fun stuff over there, and I highly recommend you come by, and I'll catch you guys later.